incapable of resolving the problem by itself, and it'll require the help of Canada, the federal government, and Parliament. One would have expected that even within a few months of the decision in Chilcotin Nation, we would have had statements by Canada about how they intend to assist British Columbia in resolving this problem. It's a very serious problem about who owns the land upon which the resources and economy of British Columbia depend. In Canada, the question of how First Nations are governed is quite complex. They are political entities just like the federal and provincial governments and municipal governments. Perhaps even more complicated because since the Indian Act came into force, it came into force in British Columbia in 1876, there's been often two parallel systems of government for First Nations. There's the original customary indigenous systems of government, sometimes called the hereditary chiefs, although they're not always hereditary. Sometimes the customary government is an elected system. But the customary governments on the one hand, and then there's the Indian Act system of government, which is often called the elected system, although sometimes that's a misnomer because sometimes the Indian Act system is in fact not elected. But if for rough purposes we talk about the Indian Act elected system and the customary hereditary system, you'll know what I mean. For many First Nations, in my experience in British Columbia, for many First Nations, these two systems exist in parallel. And to put it very roughly, the band councils, the elected band councils under the Indian Act have jurisdiction over Indian Act matters, which generally speaking means on reserve matters, matters on Indian reserves. And very roughly speaking, the customary councils, or the hereditary chiefs, have jurisdiction over the matters that are not under the Indian Act, or in other words, the off-reserve matters, the areas outside the boundary of Indian reserves. Now, Indian reserves in British Columbia are very small. They're actually notoriously small. And they're like, some people have said they're like postage stamps on a letter, but you know, even a postage stamp on a letter is bigger proportionately than the size of Indian reserves within traditional territories. If you see a map of reserves in a traditional territory, you'll notice that they're very small, often 40 or 160 acre parcels within the greater territory in which the First Nation has its lands. So most of the important resource decisions that take place off reserve, and there's not much uniformity in how this is dealt with in British Columbia. Or maybe I should put it this way, everybody's confused about who the correct authorities are. It's true that the elected band councils operate under the authority of the Indian Act, under the authority of the federal government, and quite often they are the legitimate continuation of the traditional government of that Indian nation. And in those cases, the Indian Band Council is the body to deal with. But in other cases, parallel to the Band Council, you'll have a system of hereditary chiefs or some other form of customary government that is the correct authority with respect to off-reserve matters. All of those matters concerning forestry, mining, road building, hydroelectric projects, including independent power producers and microhydro projects. In many cases, the correct legal authority to deal with those matters is the customary government. Because after all, those customary governments have never lost their legitimacy under Canadian law. The Indian Act says nothing about, the Indian Act is silent about the jurisdiction of those governments. The Indian Act only talks about on reserve matters. So, as the law develops with respect to Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal title, and as maps like the one I'm showing you here begin to develop throughout the province, and we can identify Aboriginal rights areas and Aboriginal title areas, and all of these are off reserve, it'll become more and more important for the federal government, the provincial government, local governments, and private industry to know who they're dealing with. Are they dealing with the Band Council with its jurisdiction on reserve? Perhaps the Band Council, for historical reasons related to that First Nation, also has jurisdiction off reserve, or maybe, as is in the case of many other First Nations in British Columbia, it's a system of hereditary chiefs or a customary government that is entitled to exercise jurisdiction off reserve. Well, that's a tricky question, and if you want to know that you're dealing with the correct party, you need to know something about the history and constitution and culture of the particular First Nation you're dealing with. And I know that many non-Indian people are impatient about this and don't want to spend the time, but I'm afraid they will have to spend the time to learn who they're dealing with, to learn about the history and the laws relating to the particular First Nation they're dealing with. British Columbia is remarkable in its diversity. There are so many different, there's 200 different First Nations, but they fall in ethnic groups that have amazingly diverse cultures, languages, and histories. And they're not all just Indians, as Christopher Columbus named them. They're First Nations as diverse from one another as any nation in Europe is from its neighbor, or even perhaps as Russia is from China. These are very diverse peoples with very diverse histories and cultures. So the question of who you should be dealing with when dealing with off-reserve matters is a complicated question, and one that requires respect, first of all, for the First Nation, and some research and some consultation in order to find out who the party is that one ought to be dealing with. In 1858,